So this month, our worship theme is the practice of deep listening. And today we are going to listen to some voices from the past. And I'm always aware whenever I offer a sermon about Unitarian Universalist history, I am a history geek, so I enjoy it very much. About half the congregation enjoys the history service, and the other half gets a well-deserved nap. So, whichever camp you're in, I still affirm your inherent worth and dignity. In Unitarian Universalism, voting is a spiritual act, a spiritual practice. Voting is an embodiment of our belief that every person has inherent worthiness and dignity. If we declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion, then we are saying that every person should be treated that way, which means that every person's voice has the right to be heard. Unitarian Universalism's deep commitment to democracy is rooted in the belief that every person's voice has the right to be heard through their vote. Now, Unitarian Universalists have been at the forefront of the fight for voting rights for over 230 years. Part of the fight had its infancy in the abolition movement, led by those who sought to bring an end to the brutality and subjugation of slavery. As noted in the Unitarian Universalist curriculum, Faith Like a River, as early as 1790, the Universalist Convention in Philadelphia took an official stance against slavery, saying it should be and must be abolished. They did so on religious grounds. The Unitarians, some of whom benefited financially from the enslavement of black people, were slower to reach consensus. But in 1833, Unitarian Lydia Marie Child published an appeal to that class of Americans called Africans, a book that became the central text for those advocating for a quick and complete end to slavery. 10 years later, in 1843, almost 200 Unitarian ministers collectively called for abolition, signing a statement entitled "A Protest Against American Slavery." Building on that early abolition work, later Unitarian and Universalists took a supporting role in the Black-led civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. 3 Unitarian ministers were part of Dr. Martin Luther King's network of personal support in the early days of the Montgomery bus boycotts. Then, in 1965, King organized a voter registration campaign in Alabama, a state which only 2% of the black population had been allowed to register to vote. 2%. During that campaign, a young black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was shot and killed by an Alabama state trooper. King called for a protest march from Selma to Montgomery. What followed, we know, was that brutal beating of marchers trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. In defiance, Dr. King put out a countrywide call for people of good faith and moral conscience to join another march from Selma to Montgomery. More Unitarian ministers came to Selma to march with Dr. Martin Luther King than from any other religion in the country. One of those ministers, the Reverend James Reeb, was savagely beaten in Selma by a group of white supremacists. He died of severe trauma to the brain. Of Reeb, Dr. Martin Luther King declared, his crime was that he dared to live his faith. 7 days after Reeb's death, President Lyndon Baines Johnson invoked Reeb's name when he presented a draft of his voting rights bill to Congress. 10 days after that, on the last night of the Selma to Montgomery March, another Unitarian was murdered. Viola Liuzzo had come to Selma to assist marchers. She was shot dead by members of the KKK while she was driving marchers from Montgomery back to Selma. Unitarian Viola Liuzzo is the only white woman honored at the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery. Unitarian and Universalist congregations and ministers throughout the South were active supporters of the Black-led civil rights movement. Many of our Southern churches provided safe spaces where activists could go and find shelter before and after an election. Their stories have been gathered in this fascinating book, Southern Witness, Unitarians and Universalists in the Civil Rights Era. According to the book, and these are just a snippet of examples, in 1954, the Unitarian Fellowship of Augusta, Georgia, opened a multiracial preschool. And again, that's 1954, heart of the South, Georgia. Here was a church championing integrated early education as a foundation for learning. There was power in learning in diversity. In 1958, the Unitarian Church in Birmingham, Alabama, voted to open its doors to anybody who wanted to enter, black or white. This was at a time when any interracial gathering was illegal in Birmingham. Any gathering of mixed race was illegal. In 1965, First Unitarian Church in New Orleans was firebombed by the KKK because of its work for civil rights. Ben Smith, a member of that congregation, was one of the few white lawyers in the Deep South willing to take the risk and take civil rights cases. He paid dearly in harassment and boycotting. Our own beloved church member, the late Bernadette Siegel, helped found the Unitarian Universalist Church in Bowling Green, Kentucky, after she and her children were caught up in a car caravan of white-robed Ku Klux Klanners. Across the South, ministers and their families were threatened with violence. One minister, the Reverend Donald Thompson, was shot in the back in Jackson, Mississippi, and forced to flee for his life. As many Unitarian Universalists throughout the South experienced, there is sometimes a cost to be paid when we declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion. When we say that every voice has a right to be heard through their vote, there are sometimes consequences. So Unitarian and Universalists were supporters of the Black-led civil rights movement. But in the earlier fight to secure voting rights for women, Unitarians and Universalists were the leaders themselves. In 1845, Unitarian and Transcendentalist Margaret Fuller published Women in the 19th Century, which is considered this country's first book about feminism. 3 years later, in 1848, the first ever Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. One of the co-organizers and impassioned speakers at that convention was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. 3 years after that, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Unitarian Susan B. Anthony, and they became lifelong friends and steadfast collaborators in the crusade for a woman's right to vote. Unitarians Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe likewise were foundational figures in the struggle to secure the vote for women. In 1866, Unitarian Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a noted Black activist and author, called on the predominantly white suffrage movement to work to secure the vote for Black women as well. Other voices, many of them Black, urged the suffrage movement to also embrace passing of the 15th Amendment, which would extend the right to vote to Black men. The next year, her appeal for racial equity caused a split in the suffrage movement between those who wanted women to vote regardless of race and those who worked only on behalf of white women. The split also happened between those who wanted the right of Black men to vote and those who didn't want Black men to get the right to vote before white women did. Unfortunately, Unitarians Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were leaders of the whites-only faction. In fact, according to an online article from reporter Katie Kindelen, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony completely left out Black women's effort out of their influential book, The History of Women's Suffrage. Not one Black woman was mentioned in that seminal work, which became the historical account of the movement. As a result, Black women were later left out of the history books as well. At the center of this intersection of race and suffrage stood Ida B. Wells, a Black Unitarian who was determined that Black women's voices would be heard. Ida B. Wells was born in 1862, an enslaved Black person in the Deep South in Hollis Springs, Mississippi. Her parents, Elizabeth and James, were enslaved. 3 years after her birth, Elizabeth, James, and Ida found themselves among the great mass of Black people declared free by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. As Ida would quickly learn, slavery may have been abolished in name, but the white supremacist subjugation of Black Americans continued. As a young woman, Ida B. Wells began writing about racial injustices, and Black newspapers around the country began to pick up on her essays. She went on to become the first Black correspondent for a major white newspaper, and also to write the first book in the nation to expose the ongoing and horrific legacy of lynching of Black people in America. She later was a founder of the NAACP. But just as impactful was her work for racial equality in the fight for a woman's right to vote. In an online article for the National Park Service, Paula J. Giddings recalls a time in 1894 when Ida B. Wells visited with Susan B. Anthony and debated her about pushing Black women to the side in the name of expediency for securing the vote for white women only. Ida's retort that strategy would only confirm white women's segregationist views was borne out a few years later when Black women were banned from the suffragist national meeting in New Orleans. Ominously, says Giddings, some of that group's leaders began assuring white Southerners that the way to sustain white supremacy was to enfranchise educated white women by giving the white women the vote and keeping the vote away from black women. As Ida B. Wells famously said, with no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. Would you say that quote from Ida B. Wells with me? With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. It all came to a head in 1913, on the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. A massive march for suffrage was planned, the largest ever, with women from all around the country gathering in Washington, D.C. Ida B. Wells was there to march with the Illinois contingent, excited for the historic moment. Just before the parade began, the organizers announced that black women would not be allowed to march with the white women. They could have their own black section at the end of the parade. Ida B. Wells begged the Illinois delegation to reject this act of white supremacy. Paula J. Giddings quotes Ida as saying, "If you do not take a stand now in this great democratic parade, then the black women are lost." Giddings says, when the leader of the Illinois contingent sided with the segregation order, Ida B. Wells, vowing to march with them or not at all, left the room. Giddings continues, when the women began marching, Ida was nowhere to be seen in that white women contingent. But then suddenly she materialized out of the crowd. She stepped forward and took her place with the white Illinois delegation. Then two white suffragists, Belle Squires and Virginia Brooks, took positions on each side of her and linked arms with her in an act of shared defiance. The Chicago Blade Axe, a black newspaper at the time, noted that Ida B. Wells, quote, proudly marched with the head ladies of the Illinois delegation, showing that no color line existed in the first national parade of the noble women who are in favor of equal suffrage. End of quote. On that day in 1913, the 19th Amendment granting the vote to all women, black or white, Ida won, was still 7 years away. The civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s was still 40 to 50 years away. And today, some 111 years after that 1913 march, equal access to the ballot box for all people is not guaranteed. A radicalized Supreme Court gutted the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act. Ongoing voter suppression efforts are widespread in red states. In Unitarian Universalism, voting is a spiritual act. Voting is a spiritual practice. Voting is an embodiment of our belief that every person has inherent worthiness and dignity. If we declare that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion, then we are saying that every person's voice has the right to be heard. Unitarian Universalism's deep, deep commitment to democracy is rooted in the belief that every person's voice has a right to be heard through their vote. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen and amen.